Hello, this is going to be a breakdown for this project that I worked on recently, created inside a Cinema 4D in collaboration with my friend Amanda, who did the initial concept drawing for this. So my task was to translate this to 3D and to animate it, and I'm going to break down my project file and how I created this effect. I created two different versions of this, but both of them are pretty similar to each other. The only difference between the two of them is that the sort of liquidy, fluid, milk type texture effect in the background is a little bit more explosive in one versus the other, but I'll be breaking down the main one that I created, which is the slide-ish version that I am showing here. So let's jump into the project here. So I created this in R25, but most of the effects that I use in here can be created in any of the most sort of recent versions of Cinema 4D once they had the volume builder added to the program, because that is how I do the meshing in my project here for the splat. You could do the meshing of the splat in a number of different ways, but that was the way that I chose to do it in this one, and for the most part it worked out pretty well. And since that's what I'm just mentioning here, that's what I'm going to break down first. So let's hide everything else in my scene and jump into the splat. So this is my main splat that I have here, grouped in this null grouping here, and the main composition of this splat here, and I'll turn off my extra cubes here just so that they're not in the way, is I am using a volume mesher and a volume builder in order to create this effect. Now if I disable these, you'll see that below here I actually have a bunch of spears, and these spears are what I am meshing together to create the look that I was going for based off of the original reference image. These are controlled via a cloner here, and this cloner has of course a simple spear in here with 15 segments and 15 for the radius, and that was just figured out by trial and error. But the way that this is actually being controlled directly is from a splat shape fill that it actually has bones on it that are used in order to create the effect that I was going for here. So if I scrub my timeline here and give it a second to respond, and let's do something really quick. So my scene is being a little bit slow right now because I have other things that are meshed even though they're not seen here. So I actually have some quick selects here set up so that I can disable everything in the background that might be hosing up, and now I can play out my scene as I would like to. So you can see that it sort of comes together and folds once it sort of lands on the ground here. Now to show you how this splat actually looks, let's hide the spears and turn on my new splat here. So you can see in here that my shape that I'm actually attaching my spears to is an outline of my actual sort of original splat that I had in my reference design here. So inside here I have bones, and I also, let me unlock this here, I have sort of the base geometry mesh here. So if I click this, you can see that I have a simple mesh outline here, and this was created using splines. So I took the outline from this original PSD file, brought them into Cinema 4D, extruded the shape, and picked a sort of segmenting of the faces that worked well for the eventual rig that I created on here. And I was able to sort of mesh it together using the sort of character system inside of Cinema 4D in order to have control over how things actually wanted to be sort of unfolded here. So you can see that it actually curls up in the beginning, and then once it lands, it sort of unfolds and reveals. And I had a couple different options of these that I went with. Some were more sort of unfoldy, some were more sort of just straight out and stretching. But this is the one that I sort of went for in the end, and it looks kind of janky right now, which it totally does. But when you have your cubes added to this, or your spears added to this, then it sort of all blends together. And when you turn on your volume builder, you can see that then everything sort of mushes together, and the original shape that you're using doesn't quite matter as much. Now there was some other elements that I used in addition to this. So in addition to my main Splat cloner here that is being driven via my shape geometry that is rigged together, I also have some extra Splat cubes. So these Splat spears are sort of these little extra bits that come out that just add a little bit of visual interest and drips on the side that you would have if this was sort of more of a goopy material, which is sort of what I had in my mind at least. And then in addition to those, I also have some Splat cubes, and these cubes, which you can't see them as much right now because they're pretty much hidden in my scene, but they actually correlate to these cubes that come out as well. So I have these extra cubes that just sort of add more interest to the design here. But what I have happening is that I also have sort of another version of these that are in sort of the mesh here, and these really just sort of show that there are pieces that are coming out of our original sort of goopy material. Now they're pretty quick, so they don't do too much there in terms of them being meshed together here, but in addition to these shooting out of my scene, I also have them emit additional particles. So inside of these cubes that shoot out, there's also a small emitter in here that also emits out more spears, and these spears do have a little bit of a displacer on them just so that the shape isn't completely the original shape of the spear, just to give it a little bit of variance, even though it comes across really quick. But really what they do is they just shoot these extra particles throughout the scene so that you're able to sort of add sort of that extra layer of, I don't know, goopiness that would come out of this type of material, or at least that's the thinking behind it. And they sort of just come out and they eventually fall back down on the ground, because I believe I do have gravity set up in my scene. So they actually fall back down, and eventually, because of the controls of the emitter, they will stop emitting and they will sort of, scale down to 0. Granted, when they come out of our sort of volume builder here, depending on how far they're away from each other and from the original material, they'll pretty much dissolve into nothingness anyway, which is kind of how it would work more or less in real life there. So that's sort of the extra bit that I have in my sort of original Splat here. And like I mentioned earlier, I do have versions of this where there are, different, I guess you could say, simulations of how things sort of come out from my original mesh. Beyond the fact that originally when I created this, I wasn't using bones and geometry. I was using more of a soft body mush dynamic system of a spear that I had the additional spears cloned onto it, and then that's what was meshed. But for the particular look that was requested for this project, I tweaked my sort of reveal of the Splat in order to get this type of effect that I was going for. So that's how I built the Splat here. And then when you turn on the mesh, of course, then you're able to add materials on top of that as well. And I do have a subdivision surface here on top, but I think I deemed at the time that I didn't need the extra level of detail and the extra bit of slowdown that it added to my processing of the scene. So I was able to just keep that off, and I think I wound up doing that for a lot of them. I believe originally in my mesher here, I actually had the adaptiveness a bit higher to simplify the geometry. So you can actually turn this up and it'll simplify the geometry of your sort of mesh here. But I determined that I wanted to have more accuracy on the initial rather than later on. So I wound up disabling that and keeping it pretty low and then just not using my subdivision surface. So that's how I created the splat for this scene. There are some other elements that I tried in this in terms of, you can see I also have some random placement that adds some little bit of movement to the spears that are in the original cloner mesh. This is move instances from my mograph instance was from when I was using a different system for doing the meshing here, which turned out not to be as effective as what I wanted to use. So that composes of the main parts of the splat that I have here in my scene. Okay, now moving on from here, we're going to check out our text animation here. So again, there's not too many different parts that compose of my project overall, so it'll be pretty quick to go through these different parts. But let's hide our splat here and let's turn on our text here. So if we play this down, and I can turn off so here you can see that we have the draw on for our love text, which was taken from our original concept drawing that we were given here. So the main idea of this is, if you're familiar with Cinema 4D, is sort of using splines in order to draw on this effect here. So let me open up different things that I have here. So I have a couple different layers here. I have the main love, that's sort of the purple pink color, and then we have sort of the lighter pink behind it. These are using sweep objects in order to draw them out. The one thing that I might be doing a little bit different with these is, in addition to sort of animating the sort of, I guess, end growth, I also animate the scale in order to sort of have them sort of come out with sort of a tapered effect rather than just sort of a straight reveal across, since I wanted to sort of look like it was growing out rather than just sort of, you know, a clean wipe across. Granted, when I do have this in my volume builder and volume mesher, that sort of rounds out everything and smooths it, but I still wanted to have more of a tapered effect for the draw on rather than sort of a straight reveal, as I mentioned previously. And I have that effect for both of the sort of main inside reveal and the main sort of outside reveal as well. The main difference is that for the sort of backing fill, I also animate the dilate and erode on the volume builder. So again, I'm using the volume builder in order to sort of create the sort of bubbly, sort of, I guess, rounded effect that was in the original concept design that I was given here. So I also animate that to sort of grow on this sort of backing area as well, just so that it's not just a straight sort of draw on, it sort of grows and draws on as well. But that as, I think, sort of an interesting effect that I think was suggested as well. So it was a good idea to use there for this sort of effect. And then very similarly for the ribbons here, I also have these sort of reveal on. Now, in the case of the ribbons here, I don't use a sweep. You can see here that my original idea was to use the sweep object, but because I wanted these also to have more of a tapered effect, I went with the spline wrap object here. This just gave me some extra control in terms of the sort of end movement that I wanted to have on the ribbons that was suggested. So I wanted them to sort of slide along the spline near the end here, which in the final render you kind of don't see quite as much as it seems apparent inside of Cinema 4D. So that's definitely something that I might have been able to push more or maybe adjust my materials. But regardless, the actual animation of this is very similar to the other one. I'm able to create sort of the growth of it sort of over time. And on this one, instead of doing the parameter 2, I only animate sort of the size factor, which would be the equivalent of the scale on the sweep object. So you can see here on the right side that it sort of grows over time. And that is something that happens on the green one as well. And then of course I offset that accordingly. So that's how I'm able to actually draw on these sweep lines across the spline here. And then using the volume builder, which I'll turn on now. And we give it a second to process. I'm able to create sort of the nice sort of rounded effect that I want to have based off of my original concept that I have here. So in the end, I think this worked out pretty well, and something to note is that this does take the volume builder and the mesher does take quite a bit of processing power in terms of actually creating the volume mesh, which definitely isn't great for playback purposes, which is the whole reason why I have a lot of quick selects here, just so that I can disable things very quickly, just so that I can actually see how things play back in real time or almost real time. I found that when it actually comes to rendering these things out, it actually processes a lot faster than you might think. So even though it's super slow in the viewport, when it comes time to actually setting up the scene file and sending it either to the render form or just rendering it on your own computer, it actually does a lot of the processing, I guess, ahead of time. So it actually doesn't slow down per frame on terms of how long it takes to render. So even when I was doing a lot of testing, what I would do is I would get it to a point that I like, then I would come over, turn everything on in my whole scene, and just for the sake of showing this concept, I'm going to enable the splat here as well. So in a second here, you're going to see that it's going to bring everything back up in my scene. There we go. And I'll make sure I'm in the right camera view here, not that it matters. And I can go over here and I have a hardware preview set up. And for this instance, I'm not going to save it, but the whole idea here is that I'm going to tell this to render this scene, and you're going to see here that even though in my scene it took maybe like 30 seconds to a minute to process every individual frame when I was having to view the mesh, when it actually comes to processing it in the viewport for rendering, and this is just a hardware render, so of course it doesn't need to actually render the scene, it just needs to process it. You can see here that it actually builds up the scene a lot faster than it would in the viewport here. So this actually does a really good job of giving you the chance to view your playback in real time, see if the timing works, see what doesn't work, and make sure that everything's working. So like, for example, I can see that I forgot to turn off my hidden mesh here that I don't need to show for my splat. So that would be my new splat. So something I probably should have put on a layer there, but I forgot to do that. Now you can see that here that we almost got the whole main part here, and now it's just waiting to do sort of the extra sort of hold frames, which funny enough, the hold frame seems to be taking a bit longer than it took to actually process the main scene here. But we can at least get to the point here where we can see the playback, we can see how it grows on, and we can see if we like that or not. And there it goes. Once it gets past that little end part there, now it's just blasting through these end part of the frames. There we go, just about. And now I can play the whole thing down here and see how it actually animates in my scene. So that's a quick breakdown of the Cinema 4D side of things here. The only extra things to note in terms of, I guess, my scene structure here is I did choose to use Arnold Renderer for my rendering system here, just because that's what I have here, and it gave me the look and it processed pretty fast. I guess next time I'll probably try, a Redshift project just so I can get used to using that again as well. But my actual environment here is just an Arnold sky with a Studio Small '08 texture, which I got from HDR Haven, or its new name Polyhaven, I believe is the new name for it. So that's what I have in here, and I just tested a bunch of settings here in order to get the sort of look that I was going for, based off of the original sort of concept that I had here. So hopefully this helps anyone who's curious about this project, or sort of myself to remember it in the future as well if I ever need to go back to something like this.